Brian Close and I have worked together since, well, the early 90s, so it's going on 20 years now. It's amazing how quickly you grow old together in the pro-life movement, isn't it? And thank you, Brian, for introducing my bride, Vera. I don't often call her my true cross, but that's what her name means. I'd like to say that when she married me, it was a step down because she went from being the true cross to being merely the true Mosher. So I'm going to talk today about why Catholics can't contracept. And I suppose if I had to rename it, I would say why Catholics don't contracept, or why some Catholics don't contracept. But it's really a talk about Humanae Vitae 40 years later. You know, I was inspired to go into pro-life work by Father Paul Marx, who passed away just a few weeks ago. In fact, just a few weeks shy of his 90th birthday. Father would have been 90 today, in fact. But his birthday in heaven was a few weeks ago. He went to a better place after having fought manfully and faithfully for life for all of the 6 decades or more of his priesthood. And he inspired me to get into this work, and he taught me most of what I know about the pro-life movement in general and about Catholic teaching in particular. And it's interesting to me that it was the issuance of Humanae Vitae in 1968 that really galvanized Father Marx to devote himself full time to this effort, and which changed him from being a professor of sociology at St. John's University there, run by the Benedictine monastery in Collegeville, Minnesota, which changed him from that to being an apostle of life, a pro-life missionary whose missionary journeys took him to almost 100 countries around the world. It was the issuance of this encyclical. He believed with his whole heart that this was inspired by God, as indeed we do as well. But many of his fellow Benedictines and many of the professors at St. John's University, where he was, disagreed. Father Marx was dismayed when this encyclical came out and saw that individual priests and members of the laity, and indeed entire bishops' conferences, like the Bishops' Conference of Canada, went into rebellion, went into dissent after reading Humanae Vitae. A key moment was when he introduced into the faculty senate at St. John's University a resolution in support of Pope Paul VI, and in support specifically of Humanae Vitae. And he was shocked when that resolution was defeated, some 81 to 67 or something, by a vote by this faculty of this Catholic college where he had spent the first 20 years of his priesthood. And from that point forward, he went around the world teaching about Humanae Vitae, and over time it became clear that Humanae Vitae was a prophetic document whose predictions one by one were coming true. What I'm going to talk about today is briefly what is Humanae Vitae? Secondly, what predictions did Pope Paul VI make? Thirdly, how have these predictions fared? And then I'm going to spend most of my time today on the other consequences of contraception, because we now have evidence that hormonal contraception is causing massive environmental damage. You will not read about this in the Times. I won't read about it in the New York Times. You won't read about it in the London Times. But in fact, we are seeing increasing environmental damage on many, many fronts from what are called endocrine disruptors. These powerful steroid-based hormones that we're feeding into the environment. And I should tell you that, you know, I went through a PhD program in biological oceanography at the University of Washington years ago, and so I have a long-standing interest in biology, life in general, and aquatic life in particular. But let's go back to Humanae Vitae itself. As almost all of you know, on July 25th of 1968, Pope Paul VI issued a brief encyclical reaffirming the Catholic teaching on life, love, and human sexuality. But the defining issue was contraception. That's what led him to issue this encyclical, and I have here the first line of the encyclical, Humanae Vitae, which is titled On the Regulation of Birth. The whole world, I think, or at least the secular world, and many in the Catholic world, were expecting the Church to endorse hormonal contraception. It had been devised in large part by a Catholic doctor, researcher by the name of Dr. John Rock. But he didn't. After discussing God's loving design for marriage and the natural law, he came to some conclusions. He first concluded, reaffirming the consistent teaching of the Catholic Church down through the ages, that direct abortion, even for therapeutic reasons, are to be absolutely excluded as a lawful means of regulating the number of children. The second conclusion, equally to be condemned in his words, as the magisterium of the Church has affirmed on many occasions, is direct sterilization, whether of the man or of the woman, whether permanent or temporary. And then he came to the issue at hand. Similarly excluded is any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or a means. Now, this ignited a firestorm of controversy, as many of you remember. The Pope went on in the encyclical to make certain predictions about the effect of widespread contraception on marriage and society. He predicted that the widespread use of contraception would lead to conjugal infidelity and the general lowering of morality. He predicted that contraception would cause men to lose respect for the woman and to, quote, no longer care for her physical or psychological equilibrium. And indeed, he might come to consider her, quote, as an instrument of selfish enjoyment and no longer as his respected or beloved companion. And third, he predicted that the widespread acceptance of contraception would place a dangerous weapon in the hands of what he called unscrupulous governments. The world, it's safe to say, was furious with the Church for continuing to espouse what they maintained was a backward view of sexuality. The view of the Church, of course, that sexual intercourse is morally permissible only when its procreative meaning was maintained. Many thought the Church was standing in the way of human happiness and progress. They made prophecies of their own, very different from the Holy Fathers. They prophesied that contraception would solve or at least reduce many social and economic problems, environmental problems as well. They predicted, number one, that contraception would reduce out-of-wedlock births, teen pregnancies, and sexually transmitted diseases. I dare say they're still saying those things today in the face of massive evidence to the contrary. Secondly, they predicted that contraception would enhance married life by reducing the sexual strain in marriage caused by fear of pregnancy. And third, and this is the main point of the talk today, is contraception would help solve the problem of overpopulation and help protect the environment. They thought the pill was a wonderful thing. And of course, we have two sets of opposing predictions, with the Church on the one side and the world on the other. And the question I want to ask and answer today is, which set of predictions have come true? What predictions have been validated by history in the decades since? Has contraception had a good or bad effect? Now, I could spend a long time talking about the devastation that contraception has wrought on marriage and family, but I just want to move through quickly and make a couple of points. This is a table of out-of-wedlock births in the United States, beginning in 1950 and continuing to the present day. And the only thing that you need to take away from this, because I understand the figures are small and hard to read, is the upward slope here. We have seen a drastic increase in the number of out-of-wedlock births. So I would score that the Pope won, the secularists nothing. Now, the next prediction was divorce. The pill was supposed to make everybody happy and improve married life. And we see what's happened with divorce rates from 1950 on. And the only reason that the divorce rate is slightly down now is so many people have gotten married and divorced and divorced and divorced that divorce is becoming less common in society, in many segments of society. And those who do get married, actually bother to get married now, seem to go into it with a little more commitment in recent years. And prediction 3. The pill was going to solve overpopulation. But in fact, what we now see around the world, principally in developed countries, but now in less developed countries as well, is birth rates falling not just to replacement, birth rates falling not just to an average of 2.1 children, but birth rates falling well below replacement. In Germany, 1.36 in child policy. And you might say, well, since they have the one-child policy, they should be averaging 1 child per couple. In the cities, the rule of 1 child per couple is rigorously enforced. In the countryside, the government has had to relax the policy because of massive opposition and because of female infanticide, the killing of baby girls. And so in many parts of the countryside, the rule is if your first child is a girl, you can get permission after 4 years to have another child. If your first child is a boy, then you have to stop at 1 child. And indeed, there are some parts of rural China where they allow everyone, regardless of the sex of the first child, to have 2 children. China, of course, is what brought me into this whole question in the first place. I was the first American social scientist allowed to go into China in 1979. I was then in the anthropology department at Stanford University. And I was present in China when the one-child policy began, and I had friends of mine, neighbors of mine, arrested for the crime of being pregnant, taken in and given forced abortions and forced sterilizations. That was a turning point in my life. It shortly thereafter got me fired from Stanford University, my complaints about this population control program. But it also was the first step on the road to my conversion. So I'm happy with that outcome. In fact, I didn't get my PhD from Stanford, but I got something more important: eternal life, I hope. You know, what does it profit a man to gain his PhD and lose his immortal soul? Nothing. So it was after I came back from China that Father Marx called the first time and asked me to speak to one of his conferences. And once I came to know pro-lifers for what they really were and to see beyond the caricature in the news, I began to want to be like you. And so it was your influence, along with Father Marx's, that helped to bring me into first the pro-life movement and then the church. But back to the point, in many countries around the world, we see birth rates. Developed countries are all below replacement. The United States is hovering just about at replacement rate fertility now. And even parts of the world that you might think of as being home to large families. Latin America, for example, the left-hand side of the page. Costa Rica, 2.1, just at replacement. Peru, 2.16. Mexico, 2.2. Mexico is actually now down at 2.1. They have a sterilization campaign underway there. Colombia, 2.2. Latin America now is basically at replacement rate fertility and falling. And even in other parts of the world, the Philippines, the only majority Catholic country in Asia, now are averaging about 2.2 children. Turkey, 2.1 replacement rate fertility. In some Muslim countries, birth rates higher in others. Some African countries still have high fertility, but of course we all know what's happening in Africa. Africa has the scourge of AIDS, which is reducing the population another way. So the idea that we were going to be, if we didn't have massive use of the pill, that we were going to be breeding ourselves off the face of the planet turns out to be not true either. The birth rate reductions that have been seen in China have not come about because of the birth control pill. They've come about because of a massive campaign of forced abortion and forced sterilization. And wherever you've had significant reductions in the population growth rate because of population control campaigns, they have come about because of such campaigns. Sterilization campaigns in India, in Indonesia, in Peru, in other countries have had an effect. So again, the Pope was absolutely right. He predicted that unscrupulous governments might use the birth control pill as a means of population control. Well, they don't so much rely on the birth control pill because taking the pill is voluntary, but what they've done is they put those same hormonal contraceptives into Norplant and Implanon, and they implant them under the skin in the arms, under the skin of women in the developing world, and that chemically sterilizes them for 5 years. They've developed means of getting these hormonal contraceptives into the woman's body semi-permanently so that they no longer have a voluntary choice whether or not to continue or not. And what happens with population in general? The UN Population Division, not to be confused with the UN FPA or the UN Population Fund, does fairly accurate projections of the future population. They do a high variant, which is the high line, a medium variant, and a low variant. And of course, the highest line there is constant fertility, the idea that birth rates, if birth rates were not to fall anymore, that's where you'd wind up. The low variant, which is the bottom line there, the bottom curve, has historically been the most accurate because birth rates have fallen farther and faster around the world than anyone thought possible 40 years ago. The low variant shows population peaking around 2040 at around 8 billion and then beginning to decline. The medium variant, the other variants, assume that births in Europe, for example, are going to go from their current 1.35 or so children per woman over her reproductive lifetime back up to around 2 children. There's no evidence that that's going to happen. So the other variants make, I think, unreasonable predictions about sudden increases in the birth rate. If we plot out the current line, what we see is population leveling off. And the main point here is population will never double again. You can't have a population explosion without this constant doubling and redoubling. So again, the population question is settled in favor of the church. And what about environmental stewardship? What about the idea, as Pope Benedict the 16th has said, that there is a pressing need for science and religion to work together to safeguard the gifts of nature and to promote responsible stewardship, to deepening global recognition of the vital relationship between the ecology of the human person and the ecology of nature. What is he talking about when he says the ecology of the human person? You know, I mentioned I went through a PhD program in biological oceanography and had a tremendous amount of ecology in the course of that course of study. And I must say that when there is so much about environmentalism in the news that I have an almost a visceral reaction to it sometimes, because it seems to put, you know, fish and insects ahead of human beings. James mentioned this morning our friend at Princeton University who believes that all animal life is created equal and that human beings should not have pride of place in creation, that their lives are no more valuable than those of fish or mammals, or I think he's now down to insects. I think James mentioned, I don't think he's gone to amoebas yet, James, but he's down to insects, so he's well on the way. The Pope doesn't view environmentalism this way. He views people as a vital element of the ecology and talks about the ecology of the human person. What is the ecology of the human person? It means living within the nature of humanity as God created him. We are putting a tremendous amount of different pharmaceuticals into the environment. And I don't want to dwell on this list. I just want to point out that the head of the left-hand column is birth control, by which I mean hormonal contraceptives. In the United States, in fact, we have done national surveys of lakes and rivers and streams. This is a survey of 139 streams in 30 states. And one of the things we find among all the different pharmaceuticals that have found their way into the water supply is estradiol in about 20% of all the streams tested, and a higher percentage in the lakes. This compound is an estrogen, progesterone-related compound. Pharmaceuticals have been in the news, drugs in drinking water. The estrogen-like compounds, the estradiols, the progesterone-based compounds, have caused already and have had enormous environmental impacts in the United States. These are called endocrine disruptors, and they disrupt the sexual maturation of animals that are exposed to them. So we found in the United States sex changes in fish. We found reduced penis size in otters. We found changes in behavior in male western gulls, non-descended testicles in male Florida panthers, non-functional testes in male American alligators, masculinized female mosquito fish. We find in our streams and lakes many fish which are hermaphrodites. They haven't developed either set of sex organs. And populations of aquatic mammals and fish are suffering as a result. These estrogen, the synthetic estrogen used in birth control devices can wreak havoc on reproduction in animals. And among human beings, of course, we have sperm counts down in Europe and in North America, in developed countries in general, which may be related to the fact that these estrogen-like compounds are finding their way into the water supply. And no one has made the connection yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if it weren't just social factors driving the increase in the homosexual movement, but also exposure to estrogen-like compounds on little boys in utero and maybe as young boys during their developmental years. And the reason why these compounds are important is that they are far more potent than other compounds we think of as pollutants. DDT, for example, has a potency of 1/1000th to 1/1,000,000th of the potency of one of the birth control pill compounds. So the potencies of these things are extremely high, and tiny amounts can have a major impact on the sexual development of animals and indeed maybe of human beings. The other thing that we've done is when we produce a synthetic compound, we lock it together chemically in a way that makes it persist in the environment for a long period of time, so that when we have a synthetic estrogen, it persists much longer in the environment than the natural estrogen. The natural estrogen breaks down in 2 days. The synthetic estrogen has a half-life of 81 days, so at the end of almost 3 months, whatever estrogen you've released into the environment is still half there. So it tends to build up in the environment in a way that the natural compounds don't. And don't forget that the birth control pill contains several hundred times the normal amount of estrogen that a woman's body would produce. It's a massive dose of a powerful steroid-based compound which shuts down the woman's reproductive system. And so the amounts that we're talking about that are excreted into the water supply are huge. Of course, a woman who takes the pill, some of it is absorbed into her body, and some is simply excreted out in her urine. Wastewater treatment plants do not break down these synthetic estrogens. They're not designed to do that. In fact, they don't do that. So that the water that comes out of a wastewater treatment plant is polluted with these compounds. And I just wanted to, this is just a graphic representation of what I just said, that the synthetic estrogen lasts a long time in the water, and the natural doesn't. And used contraceptives, they put hormonal contraceptives, of course, not just in pill form. They put them into contraceptive rings. They put them into contraceptive patches. They put them into Norplan and Implanon and put it under a woman's skin. And U.S. manufacturers don't provide a bag for disposal. I think here they do, but how many of these actually get disposed properly, and how many simply get flushed down the loo? Of course, natural family planning doesn't suffer from any of these shortcomings. Natural family planning doesn't pollute the ecology of the woman's body with huge amounts of synthetic compounds, which then go on from her body into the environment as a whole and cause damage to the environment. They're safe, healthy, effective, and environmentally responsible. And I would say that we need to get this word out. We need to piggyback on the huge amount of attention that's paid to green issues and environmental issues to say, wait a minute, if you're worried about protecting the environment, you've got to come out against these compounds that are causing damage not just to women, and we haven't talked about the damage caused by hormonal contraceptives on women's bodies, but to the larger environment as well. If you want to protect the environment, then we have to declare some of these compounds to simply be unacceptable. And so I would say 40 years later that the church is right and the world is wrong on the issues that were so much in debate 40 years ago. Every prediction that Pope Paul VI made about the devastation that contraceptives would cause, lowering the status of women, devastating marriage, have been proven true. It has been proven, such drugs and devices have been proven a weapon in the hands of unscrupulous governments. The family has been attacked, whole populations have been attacked. And of course, I have to tell you, as you all mostly realize, that Pope Paul VI did not base his condemnation of contraception on his prediction that the use of contraception would have bad consequences. Rather, he argued that contraception is wrong because it is not in accord with the truth about the human person and the truth about the meaning of marriage. We understand marriage to be an elevated calling where God enlists spouses into the all-important enterprise of bringing forth new life. To use contraception is to reject God and his life-giving ways. So the church does not teach contraception is wrong because it has bad consequences. The church says contraception will have bad consequences because it is wrong. And as we've seen today, contraception is wrong indeed. Marriage is sacred, and children are a gift. Thank you very much. Thank you. Question? Okay.
So do we have any questions here? Yes, sir.
Should I say anything to the school?
Well, as a parent, of course, that's always a difficult question because you don't want your child to suffer from your own indiscretions, and sometimes our children don't want us to contradict their mentors in school. The fact is that there is so much nonsense now in the educational literature and indeed in the scholarly literature about overpopulation that if she didn't encounter it in this grade, she'd encounter it in the next, and she'd certainly have it when she went to university. But all of those predictions that began in the 1960s that we all grew up hearing have been proven false. Fertility has fallen farther and faster than people ever thought possible. Back in the 1960s, the idea was, well, Africa, Asia, and Latin America will have to reach the developed world, European and North American standards of living before the birth rate begins to come down. That turns out not to be true. That people in even relatively poor countries, once they begin to look outside, once they have the window on the world called the television, a mixed blessing if there ever was one, they begin to see people elsewhere having fewer children, and the culture begins to change. Latin America, a Catholic continent, I mentioned, already has birth rates that are at replacement. And there's nothing magical about replacement. We used to be told, well, we need to get to zero population growth. We need to bring the birth rate down to an average of 2.1 children, as if that were some magic level that population growth would level off at. Well, it would be if people stopped there, but they don't. They go right past 2 children down to 1 child, and in some cases have no children at all. And so the long-term problem of humanity is not too many children, it's too few children. And we already see that the demographic winter settling in over Europe with falling birth rates, with hospitals in Germany closing down maternity wards and cemeteries opening up everywhere. That's not a very happy fact. But let me close with a happy fact, and that is it doesn't take everybody having 2 children to replace the current population. What it takes is a committed minority. If 10 or 15% of the population decides to be generous in welcoming children from God, and continues to regard, in the face of secular criticism, babies as a blessing and not as a burden, then they can replace the missing children that people on the other side refuse to have, and keep the population in balance, or even keep the population growing. We have done. How many of you have been on YouTube? YouTube? Okay, those of you who have. I have to go on YouTube. I have all these children. So we actually now at PRI are doing YouTube videos, YouTube cartoons. They're about 2 minutes long, addressing the myth of overpopulation, addressing whether or not overpopulation causes hunger. Short answer, it doesn't. And it's available, these are available on YouTube. And what you should do is you should show your daughter a couple of these cartoons and have her forward them to her friends. And I guarantee these cartoons are funny, they're geeky, and they're just what kids like to watch. And they can be found at Population 101. That's our online college course in population issues. YouTube, Population 101. And I think that'll go a long way towards correcting the misimpression that they're giving your daughter in school, that there are too many people in the world, and that she better not have children, otherwise she'll be contributing to the overpopulation problem.
Typically, what sort of response do you get from medical organizations and ecological organizations when you raise these issues? Do they deny the science, or do they just ignore it altogether? What sort of answer do you get to this issue of the contamination in the environment?
Hormonal contraception in the United States is a $15 billion industry, and it, like all big business, it likes to defend itself from any and all charges. And so There have been press reports about this. We have been writing about this. The contraceptive industry funds studies which deny this has an important effect. So what you have is sort of, we call it in California bluegrass music, you've got dueling banjos. You get one study or one report that shows there's a problem and publish a report denying it. And as long as they can pretend that the science is not settled, then they can tell the policymakers not to take action because the science is not settled.
I know you didn't actually talk about condoms, but I've worked in Africa for a long time, and I know that the condom is held up as the magic answer to every kind of problem, STDs, AIDS, population, etc. But then I've been trying to look at any sources that give me the condom and the environment, because I've seen some places mentioning that condoms have settled on the ocean bed and that they are sort of disrupting oceanic life, and some say that condoms are even on the coral reefs, which are mostly greatly beloved by the environmentalists. Have you got any information on this aspect?
I don't know. But I do know that any, if you send any manufactured good to a poor country, it's going to be used and used and used as long as it has any potential use, and it won't be properly discarded at the end of the day. One issue like that we got involved in several years ago was the sending of massive doses of Depo-Provera and injection equipment to Africa. Each dose of Depo-Provera chemically sterilizes a woman for 3 months, and each dose came with a syringe and a needle. And these syringes and needles were being used not just once, but dozens of times in Africa because they were valuable manufactured goods. Well, Africa has an AIDS epidemic, and it turns out that if you use and reuse and reuse a needle once it's been contaminated with HIV/AIDS virus, you're passing the infection along to other women. And so we were able to get USAID to stop, well, not to stop shipping Depo-Provera, which would have been the goal, but to stop shipping the needles and syringes. Now they ship a self-disabling syringe with a unique needle size that cannot be reused. So that's how they've dealt with that problem. The church is roundly criticized for opposing the use of condoms to prevent AIDS, but it's fairly clear when you look at Uganda that the massive distribution of condoms, along with pornographic sex education, encourages risky sexual behavior. And at the end of the day, you wind up with more AIDS and not less. The other thing that we've been looking at recently is there are some 70 studies that have tested the hypothesis that hormonal contraceptives, by thinning the lining of the vagina and the uterus, actually promote the spread of the HIV/AIDS virus. And of those 70 studies, about 60 show a connection between hormonal contraceptives in one form or another and higher risk of contracting HIV/AIDS. Now, my country sends over tens of millions of doses of hormonal contraceptives in various forms every year. And I'm very much afraid that we have, in so doing, we have exposed African women to a great deal of risk in terms of contracting AIDS. And there are about a dozen studies on the other side, all funded by groups like the Population Council, by groups like the manufacturers. They're funded by the manufacturers of hormonal contraceptives who are trying to defend their industry. But I think the evidence is clear that we have probably contributed to the spread of AIDS by spreading hormonal contraceptives and condoms throughout Africa. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Yeah. Lovely.